Hey everybody, we're back with another question and response. We are Joel and Julie Stegman from Resurrection City Church, and this week our question and response is all from the sermon on sin. So we're going to run through some of the questions. Joel has a minute and a half to answer each, or I get to hit him, and we'll see where we can go from there. So, are you ready?
Let's do it.
Okay, the first question is, did Jesus atone for our sin by dying on the cross? And was it required?
Obviously this is a pretty non-controversial Christian stance that Jesus does something for our sin. He takes it on himself so that we may sort of avoid the consequences of God's wrath. I think it's a part of God's character that he does something about sin, and we as being sinful humans, God is just in doing something about that, but in order to sort of avoid the consequences of that, God takes that sin upon himself in Jesus. The Apostle Paul spends a lot of time unpacking this in different letters of his. In the book of Hebrews, you get some of this as well. I think Jesus kind of just implies it. But I'll just say this too. I mean, that's a kind of a narrow, and not in a bad way, I'm not saying this in a bad way, but like it's kind of an essential part of the gospel and what happens on the cross. But it's not the only thing that happens on the cross, and there's other sort of important strands of what's going on the cross that Jesus is doing. I think we as Christians, especially maybe in more reformed settings, it'd be good for us to just sort of expand our vision for what's happening on the cross beyond just the idea of atonement.
Okay. So this question is kind of about how Christians should think about legislation. So where is the line in terms of what Christians should try to see done through legislation? Yeah,
it's a really good question. And I know I mentioned it in the sermon a little bit and talked about how this has been a sort of a fundamental thing that I think the church has been seeking out, especially recently. And so it opens up a whole can of worms that I obviously didn't really talk about in the sermon. For me, I think it's important to understand the early Christians had no political power and had really no ability to change their society in any substantial way by going up to the top of the government. And so their approach, and whether this is just because they couldn't do anything else or because this is all they thought was important, it'd be interesting to ask one of them. We don't know for sure. But what they did was they tried to bring the kingdom of God to heaven through building communities that modeled or anticipated what the kingdom of God would look like when it came in its fullness in Jesus, and living in the way that Jesus had given them, founded on repentance, on forgiveness, and on kind of walking in line with that. And we live in a totally different context than they do. We live in a democracy where we do have some ability to speak into what the laws of the land that we live in are, and that's something that early Christians didn't have. So we are stuck with the question of how we go about doing that. And this is an incredibly complex question. I think it's one that people a lot smarter than me probably are continuing to think through all the time. And I would just say, I think it's important that we understand we live in a pluralistic society. We should seek consensus rather than domination, and not forget to keep the main thing the main thing. I think it's important for us to understand as Christians that legislation matters, and it's good for us to engage in that, but to always believe that it goes further to change people's hearts and change communities than it is to force them to do something through legislation. And so I think we should be about that fundamentally, over and against legislation, but not at the expense of legislation.
Okay, so this question is about the internet, and it just asks, has the internet and networking tech in general perpetuated or merely exposed the sin of humanity?
Yeah, I don't think that anything that we've seen come out of humans since the advent of the internet, and talked about this a little bit in the sermon, is new. It's been created by the internet. But I do think, and I don't think it's just the internet, like there's lots of human innovation that does this, I think, and we can point to it over the course of human history, that sort of gives an opportunity for aspects of human nature to come out in greater ways, like pouring fuel on the fire. But I mean, that said, like We did a sermon series in Proverbs last spring. We talked about the mocker, and the way that person is described sounds an awful lot of like Twitter trolls, or people who go and comment threads on videos or goes into message boards or whatever, and just seem to be out to cause a stir. And so the bigger thing is that the internet connects people together, and I think the story of the Tower of Babel is sort of a tale that explains what happens when humans are connected, that they have the ability to sort of come together and do some things that God says this is not good for the world when they come together, and all of this sort of accumulates with itself. And so what God does is he scrambles their language so that they can't come together in the same way that they did in the Tower of Babel. One of the interesting things is that the internet has sort of made it so that sort of the effects of the Tower of Babel, of scrambling language, has been undone. And so are we seeing new towers of Babel being built through the internet? I don't know, and it's a good question.
Okay, this is a big one. What is the origin of sin? Is it the Garden of Eden? Before that, Egypt?
Yeah. This is this is something the philosophers debate, and so I won't try to give an answer to it. I think it's fair to say that the origin of sin's effect on God's world, and on sin sort of resonating out of human hearts as sort of a origin point in the world out of human hearts, that seems to happen in the Garden of Eden. Now, there's another character in the Garden of Eden, the serpent, who seems to have a goal of sort of bringing this with him. And what's the serpent's story? We just don't know. And so what does that say for where sin or evil originates from? It's probably better to just throw your hands up in the air and say, not totally sure. We're confident on the effects of sin, and we know the hope and the answer for it, but we don't necessarily know for sure where it comes from in its fullness. We know how we play into the story of those humans, and I think that's the story that the Bible in the Garden of Eden is trying to tell, where we come into the story as humans.
Okay, now a question related to sin and its effects in the world. Why was sin not instantly eradicated at the resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah, another question that we pay philosophers to think about, I suppose. There's lots of things I think I could say. I think, first of all, in the story of the Bible, instead of starting with the question of why did God choose to do what he did or not do or something, in the story of the Bible, we're supposed to understand Jesus' resurrection as a sort of deposit, or like the first fruits of a hope of what you're asking about, the sort of eradication of sin in the redemption or resurrection of humans in the world. And so the resurrection is supposed to be seen as two-staged in the grand scheme of things. The first stage is Jesus, when he sort of inaugurates the hope of eradication, and that's what the Spirit coming does. It's this sort of first fruits, this deposit, this sort of beginning of that. But we're waiting for the end of that to come in Jesus' resurrection. Now, as to why, I don't know. One just thought I would give is it seems to be the pattern of how God chooses to work in the world in every way. He likes to work, he chooses primarily to work through people, to do so incarnationally, to sort of work with people, to bear with them, to have people be a part of what he's doing. Scripture is written this way, and I think that for reasons that are to God, that pattern is important to him, and we see that exact same pattern, I think, playing out in what we're talking about here.
All right. Here's a fun one. So since you brought it up, where's the line between personality traits and sanctification?
Yeah. So the short answer, I guess, and this probably demands a much longer answer than what I'm going to give here, is that we're all unique. Personality is true. We have different personalities that are unique to us. And so that requires, in a lot of ways, unique sanctification, kind of in accordance with our personalities. So there's nothing wrong with sort of knowing your personality and sort of using wisdom in how you sort of do things. If you're more introverted, to try to, understand that about yourself and understand you're going to follow Jesus better probably when you sort of live into that reality, when you're more rested because you have had some time to decompress alone or something like that. But using your cover for personality to do things that are sin, that's the real problem, I think. And I think we do that probably more than we maybe would realize. So I know people whose temperament leads them towards anger, for example, or confrontation quickly, faster than most people. And I've seen them, following Jesus, try to learn to control their anger better. And I think they would say this is a major part of my sanctification, knowing that I'm uniquely sort of predisposed towards this. They weren't content to just say, well, this is my personality, God needs to deal with it. So just because you're prone to something that might harm people or mess with God's shalom, we'll talk about this in a little bit, doesn't mean you can sort of dismiss it. And so I think the way we should think about it more fully is see sanctification as the redemption of our personalities. So if you have a personality that's prone to confrontation, right, you can redeem that in a way that is like a part of the coming of God's kingdom. You can use it to protect people or not fearing, maybe speaking up in places where you might need to. And you can use that as a gift to help other people in the service of God's kingdom. And so I think we should think about redeeming our personality traits, and I think that's how we should see sanctification, as opposed to using them as crutches to not have to grow.
Okay. So are there times where we can be held responsible for the sins of others? And how do we address and correct the sins of others?
Yeah. So I'm not entirely sure what the questioner means by responsible. And so maybe my answer is, hopefully it's getting at what you're asking. But I think there's a bit of a balance in the Bible. I do think the Bible makes it clear, and we talked a little bit about this on Sunday, that we're responsible for our own sins. And there's another question coming up here in a little bit where we'll maybe talk about that a little bit more. But I think we also have to understand that sin has consequences, and they don't just affect the person who does them. They sort of break apart the fabric of the shalom of God's world. They vandalize it. And so piecing that back together again can become the responsibility of others. And so in a sense now, we're all responsible for the effects of sin in the world. Like, we've all inherited broken systems, broken ways of viewing the world, broken hearts ourselves, that we are responsible. That necessarily we might not be responsible for committing ourselves, but we have responsibility, I think, if we follow Jesus, to be a part of the piecing back together of shalom. A great example of this, I think, is just in the where we find racism still around in America here today, and maybe seeing the effects of that upon people, upon cultures, upon systems, whatever it is. No one alive owned slaves back when slavery was legal here in the United States. No one alive shipped black people to America and said that you were less than everybody else, and you aren't a full person in the way that I am. Nobody alive did any of that stuff. But that doesn't mean that we should get off the hook for dealing with the fallout of it, because we're finding it's still, it's wrecked our society. And so I think we should be willing to engage in the responsibility of piecing back together God's shalom, even if it's not something we're directly responsible for.
Okay, so this question is essentially asking if Jesus is anti-Jewish. So they point out there's a rejection of the law, that's how they're reading it, a rejection of the law, rejection of Pharisees, rejection of the way of life. And so, yeah. Yeah,
so I guess just off the bat, I would really disagree with this assessment in the question, sort of saying that the way of Jesus is anti-Jewish. And even some of the things, and this is, I'd love to talk more about this with you in person, Amber. So if this is you, go ahead and reach out to me. Seeing it as rejection of the law, rejection of the Pharisees and Jewish people, rejection of all of Israel, to welcome Gentiles, and that's just fundamentally, I don't think at all what Jesus is talking about. So I would say I kind of really disagree with this assessment. Jesus isn't rejecting the law, he's rejecting misuse of it. And in fact, Paul kind of goes out of his way in like Galatians 3 and 4, especially, to kind of say, Jesus is, fulfilling the law. And here's the role the law was supposed to play, and it's reaching a certain phase in its life that, with the advent of Jesus, that is maybe ended, but that doesn't mean the law was bad or Jesus was rejecting it or anything like that. Jesus saw it as very good. He's not rejecting Jewish people whatsoever. He's come to the Jewish people like the prophets in the history of Israel would do, to come to sort of challenge them to respond to what God is doing. That's not a rejection of them. That's actually out of love for them that he does this. and Paul in Romans 9 through 11 talks a little bit more about the interplay of this. Jesus isn't rejecting Pharisees. He's actually coming to tell the Pharisees, hey, you're the ones who've rejected God, and to sort of draw their attention to that. So I would say nothing about what Jesus says is actually anti-Jewish. If anything, I would say the best way to look at it is it's the Jewish hope and story being fulfilled in Jesus. And so if he seems to be rejecting people, that's because they're rejecting that. So yeah, anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to kind of some of those questions about sins and sins of other people, is generational sin a thing?
Yeah, so I wasn't totally 100% sure, like generational sin, like we inherit from a generation before us, that gets passed down between generations, or just like a whole generation can be taken up by it. Couple quick thoughts on both of those maybe. Ezekiel 18 talks about this a little bit. Some people in Ezekiel's day were complaining that they were dealing with the consequences of their forebears, and it wasn't fair. And they had a saying that the fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. And Ezekiel just says, no, sorry guys, you contribute too. You can't just blame it on the other people. Sure, they did some bad stuff and you're dealing with the consequences of it, but you do just as much bad stuff as they do. So he kind of says you can't get off the hook for the stuff you're dealing with because of other people. Now, if it's a sense where like can whole generations sort of be like taken over by sin, I do think that's an okay way to think about it. To think of like generations or whole groups of people, governments or corporations or whatever, like sort of becoming almost taken over. Like we use this, we talk about like a spirit of the age, right? A zeitgeist. We have language to describe this type of stuff that sort of takes up a whole group of people, and lots of movements in human history. We can point to that. I don't think it's wrong to think of that in a sin sense, right? We have language, secular language to describe this. I don't think it's wrong to apply that in a sinful way as well. And so if, the language of possession might be a little bit more biblical way to think about that, but yeah, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a wrong way to think about it. It doesn't get individuals off the hook either, but yeah, that's a very short answer. I probably could say that a lot more about that and nuance it, but short answer, yes, but keep thinking about that maybe.
Okay, how does the view of sin that you've shared square with the concept of corporate sin that we seem to see in the Old Testament? Yeah, so this is kind of picks up on the last question a little bit. And it is true, in the Bible you do find a sense for corporate sin. All of Israel sort of deals with the fallout of what other people have done in the past. That's what exile is all about. The whole nation of Israel deals with the consequences of, a lot of times, what kings are doing. So I think the way that the Bible thinks about this is that we're bound together with other people. And in America, we're all big about our individualism and autonomy, and we don't think we owe anything to anybody else. And that's just, there's some truth to that, and it's good for us to sort of take responsibility for ourselves and understand that we are distinct from everyone around us, but we are also bound together with everyone around us. And if you, it's just, you can't dismiss that. We are bound up in a life with others. And so, again, we talk about the ways in which whole groups of people can sort of commit themselves to some agenda, right? Having a soul or a spirit, different things like that. We talk about forces that are economic or political that move people in different ways. And we see this happen. History books talk about stuff like this. I don't think it's wrong for us to sort of use, to observe that same thing and ask, like, is there some element of corporate sin, of taking part in something bigger than ourselves even, that can kind of play into that. So again, big topic, short answer, probably not the best way to answer it, but I think it's one way we can think about it, yeah. All right. What are the Hebrew and Greek words for sin? And do they mean the same thing as the English word? Yeah, and I guess I can just quickly tell you what these words mean, but giving the very large caveat of like, sin is, I think, especially a word that kind of means what it means within a society or context, and so that makes it hard to just nail down what it is. So just finding the definition in some dictionary, I don't know how helpful that is. I think it helps us a little bit, but I don't necessarily think that's the only way in to approach this question. I think we need a lot more context to it. The Greek word is hamartia.
And that can mean offense, it can mean a violation of design or law, specifically God's. It can mean failing to meet a standard, a mistake. I know sometimes people have heard like hamartia means missing the mark, kind of falling short of what has been expected. And in Hebrew, the word rasa, I'm probably mispronouncing that one, I think it just means wicked or wicked one, is probably a good way to describe that one.
All right. So kind of going along with that idea, this person is kind of responding to a question of like, are evil and sin the same thing? And they say that if sin is just missing the mark, that seems like a pretty big jump to go to evil from there. Yeah.
So again, miss the mark or fall short of some standard. That's one sense of the word, but it's not the only. There's a little bit more offense. Wickedness is kind of also baked into this idea of sin. And I'll just say this: even then, missing the mark doesn't imply mistake or accident. Like there can be intention behind it. If the idea is that God has created the world a certain way, to sort of fall short of that, to say that this has consequences, and especially when it's done intentionally by humans, like that's a small thing. We shouldn't, that we're making a big leap when we point out the consequences of this on the world. I just think, to me, like there's no other way to describe the consequences in the world of humans falling short of, what God has called us to. Of course, the world is going to fall apart when we sort of are missing how the world has been designed to work. And that's what sin is really about at the end of the day. And so, yeah, there's different degrees to sin for sure. Like there are sins that, are you hurt someone and it's a mistake that you hurt them, perhaps. Right? Or you do something really tiny that really doesn't have a huge impact on people. And I think it's good for us to differentiate between the effects of sin and treat, people and the stuff that they do with an understanding of that. But all sin is coming from the same place. And the fact that it's formed people in a certain way to where that kind of stuff is endemic in God's world, that's what the problem is. And that's Jesus's point.
All right, and this last question is, can you walk us through a biblical theology of sin and or give us resources to understand this?
Yeah, and the question also just kind of asks like what we believe about sin. I did, I answered that question or responded to that question at the end of the sermon, but I did actually, I found a really good definition of it. This is kind of a more succinct way of saying what I said before. And it said this, and this comes from Cornelius Plantinga in his book, Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a breviary of sin. He says, Shalom is God's design for creation and redemption. Sin is blamable human vandalism of these great realities and therefore an affront to their architect and builder. And he frames it, more succinctly and provocatively in other parts of the book where he says, sin is a vandalism of shalom. And so putting that within the story of the Bible, which is what biblical theology is, you hear the story of the Bible sometimes told in 4 phases: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Creation would be shalom, right? God orders the world a certain way and it's good, and it's what's God designed, the good God, the creator of the world, designed it to be. Fall is the sort of vandalism. It's the taking of that and sort of redesigning it in a way that fits what we want it to look like. And that fundamentally reorders creation in a way that it short circuits, it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to do, and it shows something is deeply wrong in the hearts of people who do it. God comes along and redeems and restores that shalom by starting with people, and that's the story of the gospel. So if you're looking for good resources, that one book I just said, it's a little more philosophical, but it's really good. Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, Breviary of Sin. Couple books by N.T. Wright, I'm a big fan of him. Evil and the Justice of God, and then The Day the Revolution Began. Those are a couple of books you could check out where he gets into that topic quite a bit and kind of does a biblical theology of sin. And then if you're, another one that's a little more philosophical, but also really practical and speaks to like where we are in the world today, is a book called Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf. A little more heady books, but I think really help us to dig down deep into what sin is. All
right. Well, thanks as always for submitting your questions. We are always excited to be able to hear what you're thinking and kind of talk through these questions. And if you ever want to talk with us more in person, please let us know. We'd love to have more conversation and dialogue that way as well. So hope to see you next Sunday, and thanks again.